.NET for Devices presents EvenTiles Part 13, Exchanging Data between the application and its periodic task. Hello once again. So this time we're going to talk about how to exchange data between EvenTiles and its periodic task. And in order to do that, what I'm going to do is create a separate project, and that separate project will be shared between EvenTiles and its periodic task. It's going to be a Windows Phone class library. We're going to give it a different name, so its name is going to be our EvenTiles Communication Class Library, or EvenTiles.com. And I'm just going to click OK there. Of course, we're going to target Windows Phone 7.1 SDK. And I'm going to rename this class 1, give it a more meaningful name, and we're just going to change it into something like, for instance, our tiles data. Now, there's quite some code that we're going to enter here, so I'm going to do that pretty fast, not showing you all the details, because it's going to be way more interesting to show you the application with this separate project in action. But the first thing we're going to do is create a mutex as a static instance variable in our class tile data, and that mutex is going to be used to protect our data. So in other words, we are writing from EvenTiles, we're writing some data to this EvenTiles communication class, and then we're going to read that same data from our periodic task. And in order to protect that data, or in other words, to prevent against simultaneous access between the application and its periodic task, we created a mutex, a named mutex called mtx-sync. I'm also going to create a few variables, a few static variables that are used to hold the data that we are exchanging between the application and its periodic task. So one is called secondary back content, and the other is a boolean called show default secondary back content, and it's going to show either some default content or some new content that the user can actually change using the settings screen of the application. Now, to access all that data, what we're going to do is add a number of properties. Those are static properties as well, so we don't need an instance of the class. The first property I'm going to create is secondary back content of type string. It has a getter and a setter. So let's create an implementation for that as well. So what I'm going to do in the getter is I'm going to return the contents of that static string variable, but we're going to do that in a special way because I'm actually going to call a method in order to return that data. And we're going to use Visual Studio to generate a stock method for us. The method is called retrieve secondary back content. And for the setter we're going to do something similar here, but this time we're going to store secondary back content, and of course we also have to pass the value that we are storing. I'm going to do that in a method again, and in a second you will understand why we are creating separate methods for this functionality. And as a matter of fact, that has everything to do with the fact that we want to protect our instance variables inside this class using that mutex that we created earlier. So let me just throw away this exception here, because we are going to create an implementation of store secondary back content, and the way we're going to implement it is by first checking out if that mutex is available, and we do that by calling the wait1 method on our mutex. If the mutex is available, it means that we have exclusive access to the variable we are interested in. Then we're going to take action, and in the end we're going to make sure that we are going to release that mutex again, and that's the reason to add a try finally block. So guaranteed we have the possibility to release our mutex no matter what happens inside this little method we created here. And this is very, very important, because this is a way to prevent deadlock in which one thread would be waiting for another thread to give up a mutex. Now, the implementation itself is very, very simple, because the only thing we need to do is actually set our secondary back content instance variable to the passed string variable. And if we are retrieving secondary back content, the only thing we need to do is return the instance variable that is currently set there. And we can do something similar for our boolean property, which I'm not going to show you because it's just boring to watch somebody typing, I guess. So instead we're going to take a look at how to use that EvenTiles.com functionality inside our application and inside our background worker. So first, in the app.xaml.cs file, whenever we are launching the application, I'm just going to make sure to initialize the two instance variables inside our tile data class properly, and I can do that by just calling those or setting those properties. And in order to do that, I need to add a reference to our newly added project EvenTiles.com, and after doing so, IntelliSense will help me add a using statement, and now our class is known, and since our class has static properties, I can immediately call them on the class without creating an instance of them. So the first thing I'm going to do is set our secondary back content property to the actual secondary back content, and then do the same thing for our boolean property and just set it to false, meaning we are not going to show default back content on our secondary tile once the user decided to add a secondary tile to their start screen. For the settings page, we're going to do something similar. So in the settings page, each time when the user changes the actual content that needs to be displayed on the backside of our secondary tile, we of course now need to inform our EvenTiles communication class, which can pass data along to our periodic task to actually be displayed inside our secondary tile. So in the onNavigatedFrom method, we're going to figure out whether or not the user has changed our settings, the string that we need to display on the backside of our secondary tile. If that secondary back content has changed, or in other words, if it's not equal any longer to whatever we stored inside our application, then we know we need to take some action. And the action we're going to take consists actually of a number of steps, and we're just going to walk through those steps individually real quickly. And in the end of those steps, what we definitely need to do is make sure that we're going to store our actual secondary back content again in our application class, so we can compare against that each and every time the user enters our settings screen. So whenever our tile data has been changed, we're gonna set the corresponding property inside our tile data class as well. So I'm just gonna take the secondary back content property and assign that to the tbbackcontent.text property from our settings screen. And we're also gonna indicate that we don't immediately want to have this data being displayed by setting the show default secondary back content property on our tile data class to false. And our periodic agent is going to use that information to display the right content on the backside of the EvenTile that the user might have on our start screen. I'm also going to determine whether or not there is currently a secondary tile visible on the start screen. Because if a secondary tile is visible on the start screen, we immediately want to update that with a newly entered string by the user inside the settings screen. And we're going to use a little lambda expression to figure out whether or not we have a secondary tile visible this time, because that secondary tile has a distinct name. And if you want to know more about that, there's a full explanation of how this lambda expression works in episode 9 of EvenTiles, and there's a video available for that as well. So if there is a secondary tile defined with a navigation URI that contains a particular string, then we know that our secondary tile exists, and we're going to compare against that string, and that string contains tile ID is secondary. Now if that tile exists, what we're going to do is change its back content, and we're just going to assign that to that particular string that the user just entered inside the settings screen. So if we have that tile available, what we're going to do then is create a new variable of type tile data, and we're just going to assign that with the backstring of the backside of that secondary tile. So it's going to be a variable of type standard tile data, and we're going to assign its back content, and that back content will contain that same tbbackcontent.text property. And with that, we are kind of good to go inside our settings screen. So immediately changes of the user will be reflected. But in order to do that, of course, I have to assign that new standard tile data to our secondary tile that is currently available inside our start screen on the device of the user. We did not make any errors here because the build is succeeded. So what I can now do is copy a large part of this functionality here, because there's another thing we need to do, and that is add that functionality to our periodic task as well, because our periodic task will have to read from our EvenTiles communication class in order to get that settings value that the user was setting inside our EvenTiles application. And the reason for that is that the application and its periodic task are running in separate processes, so they don't have any way to communicate directly to each other. They can communicate through isolated storage. They also can communicate by making use of, for instance, that static mutex that we created inside our EvenTiles-Com class, but there's no other way for them to communicate. So that's why we use that solution in the middle. And I have to tell you though that the way we are using that right now contains still errors, and you're gonna see that once we start debugging our solution. But first let's fix our periodic task here. So what we're gonna do here is again figure out whether or not we have a secondary tile available. If we have a secondary tile available, what we're gonna do is retrieve the back content that needs to be displayed from our tile data class, because it's that secondary back content property we created. And we're also gonna figure out which information we need to show currently. Is it that secondary back content, or is it some default content that we have defined inside our periodic task? And we're just gonna use a standard tile data object again to set the correct back content. So we're just going to assign that property, and this time we're going to either assign it to our default back content in case we have that boolean flag defined. Otherwise we're simply going to assign to our newly created show default back content. And then finally, before testing, we also need to make sure that we toggle that boolean show default secondary back content. And with that we are good to go, so let's test our application in combination with the periodic task and in combination with our EvenTiles-Com class. So in order to test, we are purely going to concentrate on our tile data class. I did set a breakpoint here on our mutex that we defined. I'm going to set two additional breakpoints. One whenever we want to store secondary back content, and the other breakpoint whenever we want to retrieve secondary back content. And with that we get a nice cooperation between our application and our periodic task. So the first thing that happens initially is that we break on our mutex creation. Let's just add a watch point there, and then immediately we get a breakpoint to store our secondary back content. Well, that's initial content for the first time the application is starting. You see a handle for our mutex. You see also that we are waiting to get that mutex, and if we're gonna single step, we immediately have the mutex available. So now we can exclusively set our secondary back content property to the value that we passed, and then we're just gonna continue running. And what we're gonna do right now is go to our settings screen and just modify the text that we want to show on the backside of our secondary tile slightly. So I'm gonna change it into having this even number of tiles on my start screen, and then we're gonna use the back button first to get rid of our keyboard, and then again to go back to our main page. And immediately you can see that we want to change our data that we modified in the settings screen. The mutex is still the same mutex. We can see that on the handle, which contains the same number. Since we released that mutex initially, we should now be able to grab that mutex again, so we can just alter our secondary back content property inside our tile data class, and now it contains that newly defined value that the user modified in the settings screen. So now we're going to add a secondary tile to our start screen. And what we're going to do now is just wait for 30 seconds. What you can see is that our tile is fully functional. It has that latest change in content there. It's going to alter between foreground and background content. And at some moment our periodic task will actually be activated. Since we are running in debug mode, that should happen each and every 30 seconds, or approximately 30 seconds. So our task has been activated, our periodic task, and it immediately wants to get a mutex as well, or it wants to create a mutex. And since that mutex has the same name as the mutex we were using in our EvenTiles application, it will be the same mutex. But if we take a look in our watch window, what you will see is that, hey, our handle is containing a different value. Well, the reason for that is that this is a managed copy of the handle to a native synchronization object. So it appears to be different, but it's gonna be the same object, and later on we will actually see that in action. So if I'm single stepping, we now will get ownership of that mutex, and what will happen is that we're gonna try and return secondary back content. And what you can see is that, hey, that secondary back content is null. So even though we assign something inside the application, we don't see that inside our periodic task. And there's another interesting thing going on, because after that return statement we are gonna execute yet another statement, being our finally statement, and in that way we guarantee to release that mutex even if there would have been something wrong inside that retrieve secondary back content method. So using a try finally block guarantees that we don't get deadlock, because one thread will wait to get a mutex that another continuously occupies. So that is all good news, but what we saw is indeed that we did not get secondary back content. The reason for that is that, hey, even though we stored that information locally inside that EvenTiles communication class, and even though it is shared between two different processes, it cannot hold or exchange the data between those processes. So what I did right now is comment out our mutex release mutex method inside the store secondary back content method, and let's see what kind of consequences that will have. So now our application will in fact wait for a mutex. Once it has ownership of the mutex, it will never release that, and we're gonna see what consequences that will have for our periodic task. So we changed our back content for the secondary tile again. We are gonna single step again, and hey, we have ownership of the mutex right now. We're gonna set the property, our secondary back property, and then we are not releasing the mutex, but we just keep ownership, and we're just gonna continue running. And we're gonna wait again for our periodic task to actually start. So we added just another secondary tile to our start screen again, and we're just gonna wait here. You can see that, hey, the content is that modified content once again, so that is all working properly. And after 30 seconds we will get activity from our periodic task, and we're just gonna see what's going on at that time. So we're just gonna wait for that periodic task to kick in. It should happen any second right now, and there it is. So we're gonna create another local copy of that mutex that is a shared mutex between the application and the periodic task, and we want to wait for that particular mutex until it's available to exclusively access the secondary back content. So I'm going to single step, and what you will see right now is, hey, something is going on because I'm not getting into that return secondary back content statement, but instead we have the emulator visible. And what in fact happens right now is that our background task is just simply waiting forever until that mutex will become available again. And since there is a bug inside our application, that mutex will never become available. So this is a bad programming practice. Instead of waiting indefinitely, what I should have done was just wait for a particular amount of time. For right now though, let's stop debugging, and then we're gonna start debugging again, but after fixing that release mutex call there again. So when we are starting again, the application will activate again. And this time, since the application gets its hand to that same mutex again, but the application now is storing secondary back content and releasing the mutex again, so that means that now our periodic task will in fact be able to grab that mutex again. So we're just going to wait for our periodic task to kick in again. That should be happening within 30 seconds. And I can already tell you that, hey, even though this already kind of protects our variables inside our EvenTiles.com project, it does not mean that we have a proper working solution at this moment, because we need a file to actually transfer data. But here's our periodic task kicking in again. We're gonna get our hands to that mutex again, and then if we're continuing running, what's gonna happen this time is we're gonna again try to wait for that mutex, but now every single step immediately we own the mutex, so this time we are not waiting indefinitely, and if we are running on, we are properly releasing our mutex again. Well, this is the end of this video. I hope you understand how to protect variables, and next time we're going to see how we really need to transfer data between our application and our periodic task. So hopefully until the next video.